Technosoft was originally founded in 1980 and made a name for itself producing games for the Japanese computer market. They set themselves apart with their fast, challenging, and very good-looking shoot-'em-ups. As the popularity of console games began to take shape, they moved their focus to the Sega Mega Drive, starting with a port of their X68000 hit shooter, Thunder Force 2. This began a decade of fantastic software that spanned 2 generations, including games for the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, Super Nintendo, and even a handful of arcade titles. Technosoft would be a major influence in my love for the Sega Genesis in the early 1990s, producing some of the better looking and sounding games for that platform. In fact, I still consider a few of their titles unrivaled when it comes to showing off exactly what the Genesis was capable of visually. In this episode, we are going to take a look at those Technosoft games released for the Genesis, talk a bit about their legacy, and see how it all turned out. I hope you guys enjoy Technosoft and the Sega Genesis. Given the immense popularity of their X68000 version of Thunder Force 2, it only made sense for a port of it to be their very first game for Sega's platform in 1989. Combining overhead and side-scrolling shooting levels, this game was always hard as sin to me. I've never legitimately beaten it, despite countless attempts. The overhead sections were the bane of my existence in 1989, driving me nearly to the point of smashing the system with a hammer. For a 4 megabit cart though, you gotta respect the audio and visual presentation here. While it doesn't quite live up to the X68000 version, it still does a great job bringing that game to a much cheaper and readily available platform. There are a total of 9 stages, 5 overhead and 4 side-scrolling. This is perhaps the game's greatest flaw and why it isn't considered as well done as the sequels. The 8-direction overhead areas are fast, tough, and you can spit out your entire stock of lives in seconds. It's easy to get lost and the play area is constantly swarming with enemies and weapon fire. Unless you're a shoot-'em-up fanatic, this will likely take its toll on you pretty quickly. It's still a classic, don't get me wrong, but boy does it have a way of crushing your soul and sending you to bed feeling like a child again. Luckily it's cheap by today's standards, no matter the region you're interested in. Technosoft's next title was the 1989 real-time strategy game, Hairzogs Vibe. This game terrified me as an early Genesis owner. I had no clue how to play it, and it only took a few seconds for me to become confused and frustrated with it. I had thought it was an overhead shooter like Thunder Force 2, but it's nothing of the sort. Basically, it's a one-on-one battle to the death against the computer AI or a second player. Each stage is set up with you and your opponent having a main base and a series of smaller secondary bases. Capturing these smaller bases increases your gold production, which in turn allows you to build more units. These units range in class and function. Terrain is also an issue as well and can really make things tough. The main unit you control is a transformer capable of both air and ground combat. You deploy your other units with it or you use it as a direct combat vehicle. Once you are in the position to press the attack, destroying the main base of your opponent ends the game. Learning to play this one is all dependent on adjusting to the frantic and constantly demanding pace of the action. It never lets up, there's always something to tend to, and there's rarely a spare moment to enjoy the small victories you'll have. This is one where you'll definitely need to read the instruction manual, but once you grasp what you need to do to be a success, there is actually a hell of a fun game here. If it intimidates you, fire it up in the 2-player mode and mess around with the movement and commands a bit. Put in a little time to learn it, and you'll get back a solid and unforgettable console strategy game. Things really started to heat up for Technosoft in 1990. They released the classic Thunder Force 3 that year, a prolific horizontal shoot-'em-up that really showed off the hardware. Lots of parallax scrolling, large sprites, and a great power-up system really stood out at the time, and it even has a killer soundtrack to bring the package all together. The story was a direct sequel to the previous game, but you don't need to have played it to care about what's going on here. It's one of the first shooters I played that allowed you to pick your starting stage. You can pick any of the first 5 levels, with an additional 3 after that you have no control over. While I had trouble with Thunder Force 2, I loved Part 3 top to bottom. I much preferred the switch to just side-scrolling gameplay, and found the sound and visuals far more appealing. If I had to come down on it for a shortcoming, it'd be the voices, which are scratchy and quite muffled. Everything else is so good though, you mostly won't care. I still find myself blown away by the fact that this came on a 4 megabit cartridge, the same as Part 2, yet it's such a step up in every way. Technosoft clearly was becoming more familiar and efficient at Genesis development, and this was their finest game at that point. In late 1990, Technosoft also released Elemental Master, a vertically scrolling shooter with a fantasy theme. It was quite the departure from their previous efforts on Sega's hardware. The screen is constantly moving up and you have to keep up with it. Getting left behind will likely result in you being crushed. You get to shoot your various magical attacks either in front of or behind you, and of course you have a typical boss battle to deal with. This one remained a Japanese exclusive for years, until Renovation brought it to the United States in 1993. Like Thunder Force 3, you can choose the initial stages you start out on, with the final 3 being in the same order no matter what. It's a decent looking and sounding game, but after Thunder Force 3, it definitely left a bit to be desired. If you go in expecting the same level of polish, you'll be disappointed, but take this one on its own merits, and there is much here to enjoy. It can be quite challenging too. You only have a single life. Lose it, and you'll need to start the stage all over again. This one was never officially released in Europe. Some of you may be familiar with the TurboGrafx pinball game Devil's Crush. It was quite popular in its day and was developed by the venerable Compile. Technosoft acquired the license to the property in late 1991 and released it for the Mega Drive in Japan, changing its name to Devil's Crash MD. Tengen would bring it out in the United States and Europe the following year under the Dragon's Fury branding. It was quite a unique take on digital pinball. It uses a fantasy setting with enemies on the table you must contend with, and even has boss encounters. There are multiple bonus areas to play in, and I really appreciated the sound and visuals. On a side note, this version received a sequel in 1993 that was called Dragon's Revenge, but it was not based on any of the works from the previous games. Tengen developed it themselves and released it in every major territory. Technosoft's final game for Sega's 16-bit Mega Drive came in 1992 and was the 4th entry into the much-loved Thunder Force series. It would be published later that year in the US and Europe by Sega themselves, with the former seeing a name change to Lightning Force Quest for the Dark Star. This would be Technosoft's first and only 8 megabit cartridge for the platform, with everything else before it being 4 megabits. And man, did they freaking use that extra space like a champ. The visuals here are nothing short of spectacular. I'd even argue it trumps many early Neo Geo games in sheer spectacle, with killer effects like parallax and line scrolling. The look and feel of 3D space in this one is incredible for a 2D game. Those backgrounds look like they go on forever, and I showed it off to everyone that would listen to me as a kid. And speaking of, it's got a great soundtrack to accompany those great graphics. I'd even say it might be some of Technosoft's best work on the Genesis. As with some of their other games, you get to pick the order of some of the stages, with the final half of the game being linear. You can switch your weapons on the fly, and it of course features some major boss battles for you to contend with. It's one of the finest shooters on the Genesis and a tour de force of sound, visuals, and gameplay that few other platforms had an answer for. It always made me wonder that if Technosoft could have accomplished this on the Genesis with just 8 megabits, what could they have done with 32? We'll never know, but this game sure was a killer app for Sega fans. It's a little known fact, but Technosoft handled the Sega CD port of Namco's on-rail shooter Starblade. Released in late 1994, it uses a combination of pre-rendered background video with wireframe enemies. The arcade original had been all flat-shaded polygons, but the Sega CD simply didn't have the horsepower to replicate that faithfully. The end result is a game that, while pared back quite a bit visually, still plays faithfully. It wasn't known for a very long time that Technosoft actually handled this, which is something that had likely been the case for many games back then that were stealth developed. It was the last 16-bit title Technosoft was involved in before switching over to 32-bit development on the Sega Saturn.
I'll attack the starboard. Over.
Technosoft's place in my memories are mainly there because of their early Genesis titles and the absolutely unforgettable Thunder Force 4. Each one of their releases made a significant impression and contribution to my 16-bit experience. Unfortunately, they were involved in some rather poorly received games from 1995 to 2000, damaging both their reputation and profit margins. While some of the stuff they did was great, misfires like Steeldom and their extremely Japanese-centric lineup meant their international presence diminished heavily. They never really made the transition away from two-dimensional gameplay, and with 3D polygon games ruling the industry, Technosoft never really had a chance to grow beyond their initial successes. By 2001, the company was in serious financial trouble and was easily swallowed up by a Japanese pachinko maker called 21 Company. The new owner would sit on the licenses for these games for years, not really doing much with them. In 2016, Sega purchased all of Technosoft's gaming IPs from them and still has them to this very day. While Technosoft didn't release a ton of games back then, their legacy is one of quality that really made them stand out at the time. These guys did things on the Genesis that was just incredible. Hell, some of them impress the heck out of me even now. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.